Hello and welcome to Red Meadows, your one-stop channel for all things RC and hobby related. Today we're going to be talking about converting the Naze32 from Baseflight to Cleanflight. I made the conversion because I think that it's a little bit easier to use software, and that I can, and since I can flash my CC3D on it, I can reduce the number of softwares I need to learn in order to use on my flight controllers. I also had some problems with Baseflight in calibrating my the sticks on my when I went through the calibration process for my FR Sky. I converted over to Cleanflight and everything worked through perfectly. The same setup, same equipment, same receivers, and there was no problem. I don't know what the problem was on Baseflight. I did get it to work sometimes, but it wasn't consistent. The one thing I know about Cleanflight, once you got it working, you can go in and make the modifications and it's rock solid. So we're going to be showing you a video, warts and all. We're going to show you some close-ups of what you need to do with the jumpers to make it work. And you're also going to see some of the mistakes I made, so that when you do the upgrade, flash the firmware to Cleanflight, you'll kind of see, if you don't do it right, what you're going to see on the screen. And so I wanted to share those little errors with you as well. So I hope you enjoy this short little video on upgrading the firmware on the Naze32 from Baseflight to Cleanflight. So let's get started. Okay, now before we actually can upgrade our firmware, we have to go in and do some settings. If this is the first time you've done this, you're going to need to have a jumper over top of the two pads that are marked boot on your Naze32, and I'll show you a close-up video of actually how to do that jumper process. A little bit tricky because you got to jump it and kind of plug in the USB at the same time. But before you do that, you need to load your firmware. You can load it online. I prefer to actually go to the GitHub website, and I'll put a link to that down below, and that'll give you the latest version of the firmware and all the details. So I'm just going to load it from local, and I've loaded my firmware now. And from here on in, you have to make sure that you have no reboot sequence, flash on connect, full chip arrays, and manual baud rate. This will be set depending on how your STM file configured when you first connected the board. But the top three are the three you need to be the most concerned about: no reboot, flash on connect, and full chip arrays. Now we'll go into close-up mode to see how you're going to have to actually do the jumper and connect it. Okay, so let's take a look at exactly what we're doing here. And what I've done is I've created a little jumper pin that I need to put across the two pins that say boot. Let me just make sure I'm in the right place. There is a boot pad right over here, right across from the USB connection called boot. That's what we're going to do with this little jumper when we plug in the USB cable. I'll show you what you need to set up on your software separately, because I can't do both at the same time. So I'm now going to disconnect the board. I've loaded up the firmware from local, and I'll cross that there with the pin, and then plug it in and let her go. Take your response off. That's working fine now. That flashed. So you notice that there was an error. I didn't have my my jumper on the boot pad properly, and it didn't work. So I wanted you to see what would happen if it doesn't work and how it's rectified. It's now flashing the firmware. Firmware is successful. Now that you've actually done the jumper work, you have to come in now and flash the firmware. And I'm going to, then it says no response from bootloader, programming failed. That's what's going to happen if you don't do the jumper sequence correctly. So I'm going to have to Do it again, and that did not work. Okay, no response from bootloader. That did not work. Do that again. That take your response off. That's working fine now. That flashed. So you notice that there was an error. I didn't have my my jumper on the boot pad properly, and it didn't work. So I wanted you to see what would happen if it doesn't work and how it's rectified. So that's all there is for upgrading your Naze32 to Cleanflight. And if we now go to connect, the board is there, and we're now ready to start configuring it using the Cleanflight software and installing our radios and all the other features we want to do. So hope you enjoyed this quick little video on updating the Naze32 to Cleanflight and how to use the boot pad.